Today on Voices for Change, tracking the Delta variant's rapid spread, the CDC calling it a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We unpack the reasons.
Problems of access. There are problems of access that are kind of washed out when you just use this word vaccine hesitancy.
Plus, the Tokyo Olympics get underway, the suspension that drew congressional attention.
Where this young lady used it, it was illegal. She wasn't in competition, and she wasn't at that time even in trials.
And listening to the kids, one teacher's lesson on representation.
The more they can be represented in class, the more they're going to connect to their own stories, but also to each other.
Welcome to Voices for Change. I'm Greg Lee. This month, we begin with the dramatic spike in COVID-19 cases nationwide as the Delta variant continues to spread. Cases nearly tripled in the U.S. over 2 weeks. Delta accounting for 83% of the cases. Hospitalizations are up 32% from last week. The CDC says more than 97% of those hospitalized are unvaccinated. The surge creating new challenges for local economies that have recently reopened. L.A. County responded by, again, mandating masks in indoor public places. Most Bay Area counties recommend people do the same, regardless of vaccination status. The CDC director called this a pivotal moment in the pandemic, urging people to get vaccinated. 65% of Americans over 12 have at least one dose. According to the CDC, nationwide, cases are up 171% over 14 days. Hospitalizations are up 49% over the same period, and deaths are also up to 42% over 2 weeks. The White House putting some of the blame for the slowing vaccination rates on misinformation and disinformation.
Surgeon General advisories are reserved for urgent public health threats. And while those threats have often been related to what we eat, drink, and smoke, today we live in a world where misinformation poses an imminent and insidious threat to our nation's health.
In California, between January and July 14th, 99% of the state's cases were among unvaccinated people. Amid the spike, Governor Newsom at a press conference in Los Angeles touted the statewide efforts to set up pop-up vaccination sites at churches and barbershops, but said meeting people where they are isn't enough if they're resisting the shot due to misinformation.
We need to see more courage of convictions for those that have privately gotten the vaccine but are out there preaching somehow that these vaccines are unsafe or leading the public astray on them. Vaccines save lives.
Take a look at this graph from Axios, which provides more information on who has not gotten the shot. According to data from a U.S. Census survey, more than half of unvaccinated Americans live in households that make less than $50,000 annually, 22% less than $25,000 a year. Communivax is a national coalition of public health experts and social scientists focused on an equitable COVID-19 vaccination campaign focusing on underserved communities of color. To talk about what we're seeing in the gap between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, we're joined by Dr. Corinne McDaniels-Davidson and Dr. E.J. Sobo, both from San Diego State University and both on this distinguished team. This new report Communivax just put out that puts it quite plainly, calling all this vaccine hesitancy is a myopic approach and conceals issues of access. Tell us what you found in part.
What we found, well, first of all, I just want to step back a little bit and say that most people in the communities that we studied do want to vaccinate. And that's important to keep in mind because the stereotype of those people in the disadvantaged communities not vaccinating is absolutely untrue. These people are the hardest hit, and they, to a certain degree, want to be first in line, but there's a lot of challenges to that, which we need to keep into account. And one of the problems here is that when we just talk about the non-vaccination as due to vaccine hesitancy, we're really doing a disservice to the people who we want to serve. I mean, one of the problems there is that you're blaming the individual. You're saying, oh, that person's hesitant, rather than thinking about the systems that have proven so problematic in navigating in order to just get the vaccination to begin with. So a lot of these problems are really problems of access. There are problems of access that are kind of washed out when you just use this word vaccine hesitancy. It homogenizes differences in the various reasons why people can't go and get a vaccine. Now, partly there's the basic access issues, which would be, is there a location nearby? Can I get an appointment, right? In some of these systems, people had a hard time getting an appointment. But there's On top of that, there are barriers that impede the access, even if you theoretically could, because let's say you're supposed to get time off work, you can't afford to get time off work. Your boss is not really going to want you to take time off work, right? So there's those kinds of issues. And then there's time for recovery, which some people are considering. If I get my second vaccine and I'm going to be sick, how am I going to have time for recovery? Now, if you're well employed, you can just take a day off work, but many people cannot afford to do that. And plus, what if you have kids at home? We talked to one person, she has 2 under 2, and she's thinking, how am I going to go get this vaccine? If I fall down sick, who's going to care for my babies?
Dr. McDaniels-Davison, when you consider all those factors and you look at this from a public health perspective for the state and the nation, how much does this exacerbate those communities that have already been dealt a blow by this virus disproportionately?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. It's these communities that have been hit hardest that face these kind of socioeconomic burdens and these additional barriers to getting the vaccine. And we're doing them a great disservice by not making it as easy as pie for them to get the vaccine.
Dr. McDaniels-Davison, your report also lists a number of recommendations, including a hyper-local approach to outreach, like what we've seen in some areas of San Francisco. Tell us why that is so critical.
Yeah, so one thing we like to say is that all public health is local. It takes what we call these trusted messengers, people with existing relationships and clout in the community, to have these one-on-one conversations with people to really identify what their individual issue is. Do they have questions? Do they have concerns that can be addressed? Or do they have barriers that we need to work out? Do they need elder care for a day or two? That kind of thing. And so those are all pretty reasonable things to ask for, I think. And what we know is that it takes that trust, and public health can only advance as fast as that trust can advance. And so what we need are these kind of consistent, trusted people in the communities that we serve in order to be able to respond to pandemics.
Yeah. Dr. Sobo, we heard the Surgeon General of the United States talk about misinformation and disinformation and its impact on communities. What can we do to respond to that?
You know, that's a great question. There is misinformation out there, and there's disinformation that's purposely being put out there as well. People who take this in and listen to it, they don't do it because they're stupid. They do it because they're smart, and they're trying to learn, and they're trying to find out about this vaccine, which is very new. I mean, to a certain degree, we shouldn't be surprised that there might be a little bit of wait and see here. You know, it took a couple hundred years for hand washing to catch on way back when. I don't mean the hand washing just from, the pandemic, but way back when, Florence Nightingale and Ignaz Semmelweis, that took a long time, hundreds of years before people would believe that we need to wash our hands. So now we have this vaccine. People are just doing due diligence to a certain extent. It is a sign of their interest in their health, that they're listening, that they're reading, that they're looking. The challenge there, at least as has been identified for us through the participants in our research, is really one of a kind of a media literacy. And so that might be something, we're so focused on the vaccine itself that we maybe need to sort of span back and say, what are some of the broader supports that we could give to help people move in the direction that public health knows that they should move in? Media literacy campaigns and other kinds of holistic efforts to encourage people to do what in the end will be the right thing could be super helpful.
Yeah. Dr. McDaniels-Davison, as the country tries to mitigate the spread of this Delta variant and really a race between variants and vaccines, what must happen, especially as it pertains to underserved communities of color at the national level?
So it's at the national level, but it's also at the local level. We really need that one-on-one work to address people's concerns and questions and to reduce those barriers. And so that takes an army of people. And we have these community health workers that have worked so well in San Francisco and in San Diego. These are trusted people of and from the communities they serve. And they have the ability to talk to their neighbors, to talk to their friends, to talk to the guy at the store down the street and be able to have those conversations. And it's going to be a lot of work, but it's work that these communities deserve, and it's work that we can do.
Last question for both of you. Dr. Sobel, I'll start with you. What would be your enduring message to the community, particularly those that are unvaccinated, but also to those that are vaccinated, about spreading the message and this goodwill and trust?
Yeah, it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships and listening to people. When people have a question, listening to the question respectfully, and trying to find an answer. one thing to keep in mind too, and coming back to this phrase vaccine hesitance, which you started us out on, is that many of the vaccinated people who have had the full course of the 2 vaccines, still might be a little bit hesitant. We all have questions, we all have worries. So it's not really about stamping that out completely, but it's about treating people's questions with respect and trying to find the answers and listening. So this is something that takes time. We are well past the sort of factory military rollout stage that we were way back in March, where people will be lining up and you can just go shot, 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 shot. Now we're to the place where we really need to think, and we should have actually been thinking before about this too, but we need to think about the relationship building that goes into establishing and supporting trust in the public health service.
Dr. McDaniels-Davidson, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Dr. Sobo said, and I would say that we are really going to need these kinds of trusted efforts of communities and from communities. We can't come in from the outside and expect that we're going to be received well. We have misinformation and disinformation that's coming at people like a fire hose. And in public health, we're really careful about what we say. And so information kind of comes out at a trickle instead of that big fire hose. And so we have to be aware that that's happening and use those trusted messengers, those community health workers, the faith leaders as our conduits, and ask people who've been vaccinated to evangelize for us, because that's what it takes. When you have someone who's vaccinated, it's more likely that their friends and families will be vaccinated.
Hey, look, in the United States of America, cannabis is legal in at least 36 states and probably going to be in 50 states, and even the federal government is looking at the issue.
Coming up after the break, track star Shakira Richardson misses the Olympics after testing positive for marijuana use. Next, the lawmakers calling for a change to the rule that's keeping her out.
I want to take responsibility for my actions. I know what I did. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm allowed not to do, and I still made that decision. But not making an excuse or looking for any empathy in my case.
The fastest woman in America right now will not compete at the Tokyo Olympics. After making the team in impressive fashion, Shakira Richardson was suspended for marijuana use. She apologized and said she was using it to cope with the death of her biological mother. The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency CEO Travis Tygart said this: "The rules are clear, but this is heartbreaking on many levels. Hopefully, her acceptance of responsibility and apology will be an important example to us all that we can successfully overcome our regrettable decisions despite the costly consequences of this one to her." More than a dozen members of the House wrote a letter urging the USADA to change their policies. We spoke to Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman.
Congresswoman, thanks for taking the time. You signed onto this letter calling the cannabis ban outdated and restrictive. Can you tell me your response to seeing Shakira Richardson suspended?
Well, it was sad to see her suspended. I mean, the truth of the matter is that she broke the existing rules as they've interpreted them. I'm concerned that sort of the organization that should be looking out for athletes such as her should have known that she was going through something at the time and been there to provide some counseling. In the United States of America, cannabis is legal in at least 36 states and probably going to be in 50 states, and even the federal government is looking at the issue. Where this young lady used it, it was illegal. She wasn't in competition, and she wasn't at that time even in trials. You know, it's unfortunate, though, that she's gotten caught up in this and she has to pay this price. But they don't really even have sort of a guideline to measure. How do you know to what degree an athlete's condition or performance is impaired? And it doesn't really meet the criteria that they establish. Like it isn't a performance enhancement. It isn't a health threat to other athletes or themselves. And this whole issue about whether or not it's in the spirit of the game is very subjective. And sometimes when we reduce ourselves to these subjectivities, we tend to allow those biases that we aren't necessarily even aware of to sort of creep up and have an impact.
Congresswoman Lee said these policies are rooted in the racist war on drugs. Let me get your thoughts on that, on how this disproportionately impacts not only athletes of color, but people of color.
Yeah, well, this sort of is linked to a piece of legislation I most recently introduced, Drug Policy Reform Act, which shifts the responsibility of individual use of substances to the Department of Health and Human Services as a healthcare act, an issue, and takes it out of the criminal justice system. Because if we look at the incarceration rate, and if we look at the population that's incarcerated for having marijuana in their possession, or even some other personal use substance on their possession, they're in prison. And they tend to be poorer and blacker and browner. And so I think that what she said is absolutely true. I mean, if we look back to what they were saying during the Nixon era, this was never about making communities safer and getting drugs off the streets. This was about controlling the behavior and the participation of Black community. Will do that with, heroin, and the hippie community will do that, with the marijuana issue. So it was never intended as a public policy initiative to make communities or individuals healthier and safer, and it hasn't. What it did was it devastated families, it devastated communities, and it didn't make anyone safer. It didn't improve drug use or abuse. And so this obviously is a smarter way to deal with it.
A 20-year-old Bay Area woman will compete in the Olympics and make history in the process. Queenini Manamua will be the first female weightlifter to represent Tonga. We spoke to Nini and her coaches before she left for Tokyo, learning her strength goes far beyond the gym.
Guys, thank you all for doing this. Nini, I wanted to start with you. First, let me say congratulations, and let me ask you how you're feeling and if the history you're making has sort of sunk in yet.
I'm super excited. Thank you, first of all. But yeah, I'm super excited about the opportunity. And yeah, it's just kind of unreal, to be the first Tongan weightlifter, female weightlifter. So it's still setting in, but I'm super excited still. Yeah.
You'll be right there with Nini in Tokyo. Tell me what it's been like to watch her develop and grow as an athlete.
It's been incredible. I think we've had this whole thesis at our gym to really develop athletes, physically, of course, but also emotionally, mentally. And I think Nini has embodied every single part of that. And it's really cool to see it all, not that this is the last, but it's really great to see it culminate to some degree at the Olympics.
Oh, it's like the most empowering feeling ever. It's like, making a really good lift. Usually when I make a really good lift, I feel better. I'm more calm, not so nervous. And it makes me really excited to do my next lift,
When you see stories like Nini's, how inspiring is it? And what are the lessons that you share with other athletes and students about what they can be capable of?
Especially during the pandemic, we try to talk to the students, obviously virtually, about the possibilities of achievement, right? It's one thing to have equitable access. It's another thing to achieve and excel with that access. So whether it's going to college, whether it's passing your next class, whether it's, trying to make a world team or like run a second faster in your 100-meter race, I think that if you have examples in front of you that are concrete, that have people that have succeeded, I think it makes it easier to push somebody to do that, to think that they can do that.
Success can come in all shapes and sizes. And I think when you see an opportunity in front of you, I think the best thing you can do is really go after it. Sometimes you just never know what'll happen. Like the road to success is never linear, and sometimes there are ups and there are downs. But like with effort and the right attitude, I think you'll be surprised at how far you can really go. I think Nini's a great example of that. She has the right effort, she has the right mentality, and I think it all shows up. And it's a little bit cliche, but I always say like things happen for a reason.
For girls and women that are watching this that think she looks like me, or I could do what she's doing, what would your message be to them?
Oh, sorry. That made me kind of nervous. So it's very nerve-wracking to like know that I can be a role model to other kids. One thing that I would want them to know is that, you know, if you want to like do something, you know, just go for it. You know, there might be a lot of challenges, a lot of obstacles, but if you persevere and be patient, and give it your all, you know, just go for it.
The more they can be represented in class, the more they're going to connect to their own stories, but also to each other when they see those commonalities.
Coming up, Student Voices for Change. A Bay Area middle school teacher shares the lesson of representation and inclusion with her class. Stay with us. Joanne Davy teaches 7th graders about world history here in the Bay Area. It was a lesson about Africa that led her to teach her students even more about life. Lessons about the danger and stereotypes and why representation matters.
Ms. Davy, thanks for joining us. Your curriculum teaches your students that representation matters. Tell me why that's so important for you that these young people learn that.
Well, as a history teacher, I'm a really big believer that we should study history to understand not just what happened in the past, but how the world is the way it is today. And students, whether they're elementary or especially middle school, I don't feel like they're going to connect to that unless they hear their stories represented as well, and they understand how their family got to this country or how their lineage traces back and does connect to these stories. It makes it more personal for them. So the more they can be represented in class, the more they're going to connect to their own stories, but also to each other when they see those commonalities.
Your students did this really powerful project where they wrote poems about why stereotypes can be dangerous. Tell me where this idea came from.
Yeah, so we were starting our unit on Africa, which I told them is kind of problematic because you can't teach Africa. There's so many different languages, ethnicities, histories. So we watched a TED Talk by a Nigerian author who talked about this idea of the danger of the single story, how you can know one thing about a person, a place, or a culture, but that's not the only thing. But we tend, you know, with social media or just reading headlines, like the easy way out is to learn one thing and think, oh, I know about this culture or this race because I know the one thing. And so we kind of enter that way about breaking our stereotypes on what we know about Islam or what we know about the continent of Africa versus the countries. And our whole year kind of had that lens of what's the single story you have about this place? And then we wrapped with, okay, so now what's the single story someone might have about you and how can you break that?
I read through a few of these, and one of your students wrote, just because I'm Hispanic doesn't mean I'm illegal. Doesn't mean my people steal jobs. Were you surprised by, one, how much hate these young people have already experienced, but also, two, the power that came out of putting all this into writing?
I don't think I was surprised. I think I kind of expected to hear stories like that, but I think I was taken aback by how honest they were. These kids are 12, 13, and yeah, they're already experiencing being called illegal, like that you're not a person, you are a status, you're illegal, or just facing, you know, adversity that many adults haven't faced. So I wasn't surprised by it, but I was really almost honored that they chose to speak out about it, to be very honest. And the voice that's often left out, ironically, are the children, like the kids themselves. What is your experience? What would you like to learn more of? What kind of books with certain characters do you want to hear from? Just hearing from them, it makes them more connected to the world around them. And like I said, they have something to say. And I feel like these poems I gave them kind of gave them a platform. There's no names on them. It's just who they are and what they feel. So I guess listen to our kids.
That's our show for this month. As always, we want to thank all of our guests for coming on and thank you for watching. Be good to each other. We'll see you next time.